Welcome to Africa Untold, where we uncover the truths hidden from you by history. For centuries, Europe didn't just conquer Africa with guns. It conquered with ideas. Ideas dressed as science. Ideas that claimed Africa had no history, no civilization, no genius. Today, we expose how colonial powers invented a science of racism, and how those lies tried to erase Africa from the story of humanity. Race is not ancient. It was created in the 15th and 16th centuries, as Europe expanded its slave trade. Scholars began classifying humans into categories: black, white, yellow, brown. But these were not neutral categories. They were ranked. White was placed at the top, African at the bottom. This invention of race became the foundation for centuries of inequality. Picture a dimly lit European study in the 18th century. Shelves lined with skulls, calipers, measuring tapes, and strange charts scattered across a wooden desk. A man in a white coat carefully notes the size of a skull, pretending he is unlocking the secrets of human intelligence. But this wasn't real discovery. It was deception. These men called themselves scientists. Yet what they practiced was not science at all. It was a tool to uphold power. They measured skulls, claiming the larger the skull, the greater the intelligence. They compared skin tones, writing in their books that lighter skin meant civilization, while darker skin was linked to savagery. In their hands, numbers became weapons. Charts became chains. This obsession became known as scientific racism, a system that dressed lies in the clothing of research. It gave Europe a false sense of superiority, justifying slavery, colonization, and exploitation. For them, this wasn't about truth. It was about control. And so, the world was told a dangerous story, that hierarchy was natural, that oppression was proven by science. But in reality, it was nothing more than propaganda, designed to dehumanize millions while making the powerful feel righteous. Behind the skulls and measurements was not science, but a carefully crafted illusion. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution described natural selection, but colonial thinkers twisted it into social Darwinism. They claimed Africans were less evolved. This lie justified slavery, colonization, and brutality, all in the name of progress. Science was hijacked to serve empire. From skulls and false measurements, Europe moved to something bigger, the study of entire cultures. In the 19th century, a new field rose, anthropology. On paper, it claimed to study human societies, but in practice, it became another weapon of empire. European anthropologists set sail for Africa, notebooks in hand, claiming to be seekers of knowledge. Yet they did not come to listen. They came to label that when they watched African ceremonies. They called them superstition. When they saw African kingdoms, they described them as tribal or backward. When they witnessed African knowledge in medicine, in art, in governance, they dismissed it as primitive, while glorifying Europe as the model of civilization. Their words carried power. These reports traveled back across the seas, filling European classrooms, churches, and governments. They became textbooks for the next generation, policies for colonial offices, and excuses for conquest. Anthropology, instead of bridging cultures, built walls. It transformed human diversity into a hierarchy, with Europe at the top and Africa forced to the bottom. And so, the science that should have celebrated humanity was twisted into a colonial machine. It didn't just describe Africa. It redefined Africa in Europe's image, shaping prejudice that would last for centuries. Now imagine walking into a grand European museum in the 19th century. Marble floors, high ceilings, walls lined with glass cases. Behind the glass, African masks, statues, tools, and sacred objects, but stripped of their meaning. These were not presented as masterpieces of creativity or windows into ancient wisdom. Instead, curators labeled them as evidence of primitivism. The message was clear: Africa had artifacts. Europe had civilization, and it didn't stop with objects. Some exhibitions crossed into cruelty. Crowds gathered in what were called human zoos. Men, women, and even children from Africa were put on display, dressed in animal skins or made to perform rituals for European audiences. They were treated not as people, but as spectacles, living proof, in European eyes, of a fabricated racial hierarchy. Visitors left those halls and fairs not enlightened, but misled. They carried home the image of Africa as a continent without history, without progress, without dignity. But behind the polished museum cases and staged exhibitions was a darker truth. This was not education, not culture, not science. It was humiliation disguised as knowledge, propaganda built to feed colonial pride and erase African humanity. From museums to schools, the same story was repeated. Generations of European children sat in classrooms where maps painted Africa in blank spaces. Labeled as the Dark Continent, their textbooks erased empires like Nubia, Mali, Great Zimbabwe, and Ethiopia, civilizations that had thrived for centuries. Instead, the pages told a different tale, that Africa had no history worth remembering, that it was a land waiting to be discovered, tamed, and civilized by Europe in those classrooms. Africa was not taught as a cradle of knowledge, but as a problem to be solved. And so, the battlefield shifted from skulls and museums to the minds of the next generation. As these lies spread from classrooms to governments, they found their darkest use in slavery. When Europeans enslaved millions of Africans, they needed more than chains and ships. They needed a story to silence their own guilt. And so, they turned again to science. They wrote that Africans were naturally suited for hard labor, that their bodies were built for heat and toil, that their biology destined them for the fields. In their twisted logic, suffering became natural. Bondage became inevitable. Pamphlets, lectures, and so-called research papers poured across Europe and the Americas, repeating the same poison, that Africans were not just enslaved by force, but by nature itself. This was the most brutal deception of all, using the language of science to defend the Atlantic slave trade, a system that chained men, women, and children, and carried them across oceans into generations of exploitation. Here, science was no longer a search for truth. It had become a mask for greed, a weapon sharpened to defend the greatest crime in human history. In the late 19th century, during the scramble for Africa, colonial powers declared they were on a civilizing mission. They said, "We bring science, progress, and order." But in truth, Africa already had civilizations, cities, scholars, libraries, empires. The civilizing mission was a cover-up for plunder. While science in classrooms built the foundation of lies, the media spread them far and wide in 19th century Europe. Newspapers carried caricatures of Africans as wild and uncivilized. Novels described the continent as a jungle of chaos, filled with savages waiting to be conquered. Painters put brush to canvas, showing Africans as childlike, lazy, or violent, never as rulers, scholars, or builders of empires. These images were powerful. A single illustration in a magazine could shape how millions imagined an entire continent. Stories and paintings did what chains and laws alone could not. They entered the imagination, planting prejudice deep into everyday life. And the echo did not stop in the 19th century. Even today, traces of those same lies can be found in films, advertisements, and stereotypes. Shadows of the colonial gaze that painted Africa as savage. The media, instead of telling truth, became a weapon of empire, crafting a world where injustice looked justified, and conquest looked inevitable. But Africa was never silent. Thinkers like Antonin Firmin of Haiti, who in 1885 published The Equality of Human Races, or Cheikh Anta Diop of Senegal, who proved that ancient Egypt was African, They challenged Europe's lies with real scholarship. They exposed the fraud of scientific racism. For decades, European and American universities taught colonial lies as fact. They ignored African civilizations. They silenced African voices. Students worldwide grew up believing Africa contributed nothing to human progress. This silence was as deadly as any weapon. The damage was not only political, it was psychological. Generations of Africans were taught to see themselves as inferior. Generations of Europeans were taught to see Africa as backward. These lies became chains on the mind, harder to break than chains on the body. Today, scholars, activists, and teachers are rewriting the story, decolonizing textbooks, reclaiming African heritage in museums, restoring the truth. Africa was not primitive. Africa was a cradle of civilization. The lies of colonial science are being dismantled. The so-called science of racism tried to erase Africa from history, but truth cannot be erased. From Nubia to Mali, from Ethiopia to Zimbabwe, Africa's story is the story of humanity itself. This is our mission at Africa Untold, to break the silence, to expose the lies, and to restore Africa's place in world history. If you believe in truth, in justice, and in reclaiming history, join us. Subscribe, share, and keep the flame of Africa's untold story alive.